All right, I'm standing here. I got the waders on. See? So I'm good. Well protected.
Actually, it was a disturbance up in Kansas that came around and moved down into the northeastern Gulf of Mexico and then moved our way, which is very similar to a track that we had when we had an unnamed tropical disturbance produce 30 inches of rain from Baton Rouge to Lafayette back in 2016.
The Gulf Coast is certainly an area that we are all very familiar with, and that made it a lot easier, but every one of these storms is different, and you have to take into account the effects that they're going to bring. Well, it's interesting because this would not be the first Barry that I would encounter.
Yeah, 18 years ago we were traveling through Florida to the Florida Panhandle for Tropical Storm Barry, and to think that since that time frame, the technology that we had from then to now has changed so drastically. It has really changed the way that Mark goes about recording data and sending it back to the website and streaming live. That's a big change since 2001.
Barry would certainly offer us the opportunity to deploy the most lightweight, easy to set up and deployable equipment that we had ever had in our arsenal, going back to the very beginning of these projects, dating almost 20 years ago. I set out from Wilmington, North Carolina on July 10th. I had rented a Dodge 1500 Ram truck. This is something we have been doing since we stopped using the old HurricaneTrack Chevy Tahoe in 2018. Our policy and our mode of operation is to now rent vehicles as needed, and that worked out really well. I was able to load it up with a lot of equipment, including, and I was very excited about this, a pair of our brand new Jersey wall concrete barrier clamp system anemometer devices. You know, we'll come up with some kind of an acronym for it, I'm sure. But this was the first time I was going to be able to deploy these in an operational setting, and I was very excited about that opportunity.
And what made Barry a little bit more interesting is that we've had hurricanes strike the Louisiana coast, in fact a very bad one in Hurricane Audrey back in 1957, but we have never had a hurricane make landfall on the Acadiana coastline in the month of July, so that made it an outlier to begin with.
We began the Barry field work in a very familiar area, the coast of Mississippi. I worked with one of our crowdfunding partners to set up a remote cam in Waveland, the easternmost area that we would cover as Barry approached. This region is exceptionally vulnerable to storm surge from even the slightest increase in onshore flow. We've been to the Mississippi coast numerous times over the years, most recently Tropical Storm Gordon in 2018, and then in 2017 we were there for a fairly impactful Hurricane Nate. Hurricane Nate, of course, produced a pretty significant storm surge for a good deal of the Mississippi coast, and our unmanned camera system did an excellent job of capturing those impacts. Next up was downtown New Orleans. I was quite concerned about the potential for flooding here from a combination of excessive rain and the already flood-swollen Mississippi River.
With Barry, I was primarily concerned about the rainfall initially. Going back to February of 2019, we had this massive amount of water coming down the Mississippi River basin.
This is Canal Street, and it could flood when they're looking at the possibility of 20 to 25 inches of rain. We had downtown New Orleans covered. Canal Street was a major iconic route into the city, and we had a live cam on it to capture whatever would happen. Next up was the lakefront. If Barry was to become a hurricane, then this location would be very interesting to monitor due to the extremely shallow nature of Lake Pontchartrain. As is typical for us, we worked well into the night, very late, and we would have to pass on the luxury of sleep for now. We still had to get over to Morgan City to set up one of the weather station platforms that I was so excited about. Finally, we're done. for now. We went back to the hotel in the Covington area to try to get a few hours of sleep, at least the best we could. And as we were doing so, Barry was trying to get better organized over the very warm northern Gulf of Mexico. But that being said, the biggest threat was still the potential for rain, and a lot of it. After a few hours of sleep, we got back at it early on Saturday and made our way over to New Iberia via Highway 90. People were preparing for the possibility of a significant flood event, as we saw with this water dam barrier system that was being set up around a business. Well, we have quite a history in Louisiana dealing with hurricanes. As an example, I was here in 2002 for Hurricane Lily. Mike Watkins and I were in the area in 2008 for Hurricane Gustav. Of course, this is back when the equipment was quite a bit heavier, bulkier, much more difficult to set up and deal with. And it's interesting, during Lily, in fact, we had a little bit of an incident with a telephone wire near the Abbeville, Louisiana area. The roof-mounted anemometer snagged a low-hanging telephone wire that was draped across the road because of the winds agitating the power grid, etc. Well, it's always been very challenging to capture solid wind data, and I was determined during this Barry field mission that it would indeed be the start of much simpler methods. I turned our vehicle cam around so that viewers could watch as Derek and I set out the weather station. Clearly, this was an easier process and would open up an incredible amount of opportunities to gather data during future missions. And this is what crowdfunding is all about. One of our supporters stepping up to help us solve this problem, because otherwise we would probably be out in some field somewhere trying to set up a bulky wind tower in quite miserable conditions. Now, the old system worked, and it definitely had its moments. During Gustav, when we had the camera up on the wind tower at the time, it did happen to capture the sign for Days Inn Hotel being blown over in high winds. For Barry, we placed our unmanned camera system out on Business 90 across from Lowe's, giving us coverage from Waveland, Mississippi, all the way over to New Iberia, and with several points in between. Now we waited, and it looked as though Barry may make a run at becoming a hurricane. Our two weather stations, one of them in Morgan City and the other one out on Highway 90, very close to New Iberia, were indicating wind speeds in the 50 to 60 mile per hour range, which is obviously not too severe.
That verified in St. Mary Parish. We had nearly all of the parish out without utilities for a couple of days.
But what was also very interesting, now that the center of Barry was to the southwest of New Orleans, the flow coming around from the south across Lake Pontchartrain, blowing from south to north now, was beginning to push the lake into neighborhoods in areas such as Mandeville. All right, I'm standing here. I got the waders on. See? So I'm good. Well protected. You know, we come as prepared as we can be, and several years ago there was a big flood event in Houston due to some excessive rainfall coming across Mexico from Hurricane Patricia coming out of the eastern Pacific. And Carrie and I had documented that, and we were testing some equipment back then. And one of the things that we did is we stopped at an Academy sporting goods store, and we picked up some hip waders, and we have held on to those ever since, and I'm very glad that I did, because they came in quite handy during Barry. I was able to walk around in this flood water from Lake Pontchartrain without any issues. The water came right up to my hips, and I was on the constant lookout, though. You know, you never know what's in that water. Mandeville, Louisiana. This is flooding from the lake. I'm going to walk over to the lake and see what it looks like down there. It was really interesting to see how just barely tropical storm force winds were pushing Lake Pontchartrain into these areas. And it got me thinking about how bad it was in the Slidell area during Hurricane Katrina, obviously a much more powerful hurricane that affected the area, and what they had to deal with in that situation. I knew that in a future hurricane event that might affect Mandeville that we would definitely put a camera out in that area. A very big concern for Barry was the potential of major flooding along the Comeet River not far from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. This area was impacted very severely in 2016 due to an unnamed tropical low that had moved across the region, dumping 20, 25, 30 inches of rain in some locations. So they were very familiar, the folks in that area, very familiar with that scenario. Looking at the river gauge forecast information for the Comeet River, we decided to put a live camera system as well as a GoPro system on a bridge there not far from Baton Rouge just to capture what would happen. Now obviously, and it's really interesting, things change over time. And as it turned out, the rainfall forecast was way overdone by the computer models, which is a good thing.
The forecast days before on Barry were calling for 20, 30, 40-inch rainfall, somewhere from Lafayette to NOLA. And we were quite concerned about that. And I can vividly remember on the air saying 2 days before, prepare for a similar flood to the 2016 flood. Fortunately, that 30, 35-inch rainfall fell about 30, 40 miles offshore in the Gulf of Mexico.
After we set up the cameras, it was time for some old-fashioned storm chasing. A line of very heavy rain and thunderstorms and even the possibility of some isolated tornadoes was moving through eastern Louisiana towards the Baton Rouge area, and I saw an opportunity here to do something quite unique and interesting. This is different than what we saw during Harvey, where there was a lot of lightning and a lot more instability. And the rain rates there were in excess of 6 inches per hour. The rain rate here should be about 1 to 2 inches an hour. I'll be here as the band goes through. I've got a rain gauge that I've set up in the back of the truck, and I'm going to time the beginning of the rain band until it passes, and we'll see how much the rain rate was, and we'll see if it matches the 1 to 2 inches an hour that the WPC, or Weather Prediction Center, was discussing in their latest mesoscale discussion. This one simple test, putting a rain gauge on the truck and then just sitting there as the rain band passed over, it actually worked. I took the data that I collected, that 1.5 inches of rain, I sent that in an email to a colleague of mine at the Weather Prediction Center, and I figured, hey, every little bit of field verification helps. The Barry field work was very helpful for us. We got to test equipment that we were very excited about testing, and everything worked as we expected it to do so. And in some cases, it exceeded our expectations. And this was great, especially knowing what we know now, that the 2019 Atlantic hurricane season would indeed become very busy. As we continued our travels down the Hurricane Highway, an encouraging future was ahead. We had a solid team in place, new equipment and technology, and support from our followers. The 2019 hurricane season was just getting started.